And senior researcher, Lake Chad Basin Program at the Institute of Security Studies, Akinola Olojo, joins me on the news from Dakar, Senegal via Skype. Good to have you join us, Mr. Olojo. Before we get into the request made by President Muhammadu Buhari, let's talk about AFRICOM itself. It was created in 2007 as a department or some command of the Department of Defense, that's United States Department of Defense. How would you say, how effective would you say it has been in terms of combating insecurity in Africa?
No, that's a very important question. I think when we look at the U.S. Africa Command in Africa, the idea that such an entity will be able to solve the problems of insecurity, whether it's in Nigeria or in another country on the continent, is actually one which needs to be re-examined. I think it almost leads to a fallacy. You know, the idea that an external entity will be able to address these challenges such as violent extremism, or whether it's armed banditry or insecurity as a whole. And the line of reasoning, that sort of leads us to think that relocating AFRICOM's base or presence to the continent will solve the problem is one that needs to be questioned very critically. And I say this for a number of reasons. The first is the fact that there is abundant evidence across the continent whereby, if you look at the Sahel, we've seen the presence of French troops supporting the G5 Sahel Joint Force. The violent extremism challenges facing Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, in spite of the presence of the French troops for nearly a decade, the challenges still remain, facing communities. In the Horn of Africa with Somalia, the US has been involved there to a great extent, even during the Trump administration. But communities affected by the attacks caused by Al-Shabaab have not quite experienced the kind of sustainable peace that they yearn for. So it raises the question, and this leads us to a conversation about why the Nigerian government or the leadership, has allowed the conditions of insecurity to degenerate to a point where, the country is desperately calling for external involvement. We need to look within. Nigeria needs to question a number of things, and I could go take you through a number of things. But before I get to that, I think we also need to acknowledge, and this is important for the viewers, the fact that the United States, like most other countries, have foreign policy priorities. There are certain priorities which these countries are guided by. So whether we are looking at the Bush administration back then, or the Trump era, or whether it's the current period with Biden, irrespective of the period we're looking at, there are certain priorities which guide US foreign policy. And the citizens of the United States will be placed first, among a number of things. And this is normal with most countries. So I think it's a time when Nigeria also has to reflect, along with other African countries, on the local dynamics and the domestic trends of insecurity.
Let's talk about that reflection, because a lot of security analysts have been reflecting, and I've said to the president, seek foreign assistance. We do need it, because they say that, look, the military and other security agencies are overstretched, dealing with insurgency, whether from Boko Haram or ISWAP, dealing with banditry, kidnapping, armed robbery, and all of that. And now the president is seeking for foreign assistance. You've also questioned the effectiveness of AFRICOM and the activities in Africa. And doesn't that give some credence to the president saying, look, for more direct and effective response, perhaps AFRICOM should be relocated to Africa?
No, that's a good question. I think it's more or less, it's portraying the leadership in Nigeria as more or less shifting the burden of responsibility for ensuring human security of citizens. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with global partnerships, with bilateral partnerships. I mean, we've seen even as in early 2020, last year, the partnership between the US and Kenya, which led to the joint terrorism task force that was launched between the two countries. As long as those partnerships are mutually beneficial for those countries involved. But in the case of Nigeria, I think it's more about actually not only engaging the US and other countries, because Violent extremism is a transnational problem. It has a character that is global. But then looking within, as I mentioned earlier, and we've seen that when we look within, there have been opportunities that have been missed. We only need to think back to October 2020. It's almost impossible for us to overlook that episode. And we all recall what happened with the NSAS protest. It was such an opportunity that showed more or less the strongest citizen voice on the question of insecurity in Nigeria's recent history. And it was a unique chance for the Nigerian leadership and the citizens to actually have a meaningful conversation around this issue of governance, around accountability of the security sector, on issues of the social contract that binds the country together. So these were missed opportunities, and they are gone. They happen once in a while. And I think the leadership of the country, not only the president, but also the National Assembly, has the responsibility to actually re-engage this process, whereby citizens are more meaningfully sort of engaged in trying to address this problem. And I think we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are already existing policy frameworks and national action plans on preventing and countering violent extremism. For example, in 2017, this particular framework was launched in the country. And we've seen the components of this framework ignored. They haven't been implemented, one of which has to do with the rule of law. There's another one that has to do with strengthening institutions and interagency coordination. There's another component that has to do with, community engagement and resilience building. But we've not seen the leadership actually, meaningfully implement these components. And I think one thing which is very important is that Nigerians have not seen even the president, the presidential posture, in relation to these issues. When something happens, whether it's a mass abduction or isolated cases of armed banditry or maybe Boko Haram or its factions attacks, we haven't seen the president posture himself in such a way that he's able to connect with the citizens and carry them along. So citizens are able to connect with the idea that they are being, their issues are being addressed, issues of accountability.
Perhaps maybe this is the beginning of such posturing with this request. Let's see how he responds in the coming days. There's just a lot to talk about this, especially for those who also have fears of heavy U.S. military presence in Africa. But I'm afraid we do have to leave it there. It's been really great talking to you. Senior researcher, Lake Chad Basin Program at the Institute of Security Studies, Akinyola Olojo. Thanks for talking to us.
Thank you for having me.